This weekend is a weekend in which we celebrate, or maybe more accurately, we commemorate those who have sacrificed their life for the sake of our country. And we remember those people, and we also honor their families, those who have gone on through life in their lives without those loved ones who we remember. And so tomorrow's Memorial Day. I just want to encourage you, if you're worshiping with us this morning, we honor those families and those individuals. If you know someone personally or a family personally that has been affected by, in which we are honoring and remembering this week, would you put them in the Facebook feed? Just write their name in there and let us celebrate and commemorate with you their lives and honor those families. This morning we're wrapping up our One Another series, and it's connected in some ways to this reality of losing people, losing things, losing things that matter to us in the course of our lives, and especially people. And I kind of have a reputation for being, my kids call it a dream squisher. That I kind of like say things that other people don't say, and I just believe in my heart of hearts that they're actually true. Things like, I don't believe you can be anything you want to be. I just don't. I think like there are limitations, physical limitations, mental limitations. We can't be anything we want to be. This morning kind of goes in that same category, is this. Living is losing. Living is losing. It's not pessimism. It's not cynicism. It's not skepticism, it's not determinism, it's not fatalism or feudalism. Those are all potential reactions or attitudes or responses to loss. But loss is just a reality of our current situation. Living is losing. We lose relationships to death, to divorce, to betrayal, to neglect, to relocation, to just the circumstances and seasons of life. We lose health to accidents, to diseases, to genetics, to time, to gravity. We lose jobs to corporate downsizing, to unfair, unreasonable bosses, to managerial incompetence, to changing needs in our society. We lose stuff, right? I mean, just like yesterday, I spent a whole lot of time looking for my lost knife. Thank you, right there. It's gone. Can't find it anywhere. I tore my house apart. I just lose my knife. I lost half the morning looking for my knife, right? We lose stuff. We lose security when things fall apart around us. We lose hopes. We lose dreams. Living is losing. And clearly, not all losses are equal, right? I mean, losing a child is not the same as losing a pet. Losing your knife is not the same as like losing your car. Losing comes in all shapes and sizes. Losing someone to death is different than losing someone to divorce. I have a former colleague that I worked with for a number of years, right? That he lost his wife and his mother and a daughter, all in a single car accident on just a tragic day, right? That's different than like losing 3 generations, than losing 1 generation. That loss comes in all different shapes and sizes, and it's complicated and it's compounded by the fact that we don't just lose the things, or we don't just lose the people, but there's also a whole series of events that come after that. Several years ago, I had a friend who lost a child, and I didn't connect this until I was talking with this friend about their loss. And they didn't just lose their child; they grieved that loss, but then they had to also grieve the loss of that child every birthday, and they grieved the lack of a graduation and a wedding day. There's a whole series of events, a whole series of losses that come along with many of our losses in life. That living is losing. And I want to go on record and saying I believe that losing, You can fill out any way you want, but losing, right, it just is not, it's not cool. Losing is not fun. Losing stinks. We'll say that, right? Losing stinks. I used to fancy myself a sports fan. A few years ago, I realized I don't really like sports. I only like winning, right? And because my teams don't win very consistently over time, I stopped watching sports a lot less. I watch sports a lot less because I don't like losing. That it takes us losing, anytime we lose anything, it takes us out of the world of what was as we know it and throws us into a world that is not the world that we wanted to be in. Right? When we lose someone we love or we lose something that matters to us, it's taking us from that reality and putting us into a new reality. And our losses are multifaceted, are different, but they all invoke a common response. To different degrees, to be sure, but all loss invokes the response of grief. That grief is the natural human response to the gap between what we want to be and the life that we're experiencing. Grief is the natural human response to the gap between what was and what we liked and the way we want things to be and the way that things are. And the greater the gap between what we want and what is, the greater the degree of grief that we experience. The question that we want to talk about this morning is, how do we navigate that? How do we navigate a life where living is losing? How do we navigate all the losses that are visited upon us in the course of our life? And I want to encourage you just right now, just to pause for a minute and think about what losses right now that you're living through, that you're experiencing. Where are there gaps between what you want and what is in your life right now? Affliction forces upon us a decision. The decision that we can accept our losses as the last word. We can look at our failures as the final verdict. That our mortality is the end of the story and there is nothing else. We can look at our losses as the end. Or we can choose to believe that there's more to life than what meets the eye. That our suffering is part of a larger story. And that somehow, in some way, in some shape, in some form, that one day our losses, our suffering, will be turned to glory. We can look at it as this is it, this is final, that's all there is, or that somehow out of these ashes, something new will be born. And that decision, what we choose between those two options, will determine whether we succumb to a life of despair, a life that doesn't have any meaning, or we will continue to live lives of hope. That we will, as I titled this morning, the sermon this morning, win even through our losses. Winning in loss. Is this it? That's the end? Or is there something beyond this, even in loss? And the Apostle Paul, his life illustrates our plight. I'm going to read from 2 Corinthians chapter 1 this morning. I'm going to read the passage backwards. I'm going to start in verse 8. Paul says, he's writing to the church at Corinth, And the church at Corinth is kind of an interesting church in Paul's life because it's a church that he was responsible for planting. He had a very special relationship with them. He spent a lot of time in Corinth, but then when he wasn't there, they kind of like went off the rails a little bit, and they became very critical of him and judgmental. And so he loves this church, but he also feels like he's not being treated very responsibly by the church. And so he's writing to the church. This is in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8. He says, he's in another place now, and he's writing back to their church. We think you ought to know, dear brothers and sisters, about the trouble we went through. We were crushed and overwhelmed beyond our ability to endure. And we thought we would never live through it. In fact, we expected to die. Paul said, we thought we were at the end of the road. We thought we were at the end of the road. We thought this story of ours that we were living, that it was over. And he continues, but as a result, we stopped relying on ourselves and learned to rely on God, who raises the dead. And he did rescue us from mortal danger, and he will rescue us again. We have placed our confidence in him, and he will continue to rescue us. We were at the end. We thought it was over. We put our trust in God. We threw our lot fully in with him and believes that he raises the dead, so whatever happens here is going to be all right. Living is losing, but Paul says it's not the end of the story. Now, yesterday we went to Long Beach last night for dinner, and it was really cool because if you go back, like early in the pandemic, and we were, at that point where it's like we don't know how long this is going to last, but it's like, well, what's the first thing you want to do when this is over? Well, what are you missing right now that you want? And my thing was, I love going to Tequila Jack's down in the Shoreline Village and sitting out on the patio and eating dinner. It's just a great place, and we've had a lot of great family times there. We went last night. It happened. Right. So anyway, we were in Long Beach last night, and we're walking down Ocean Avenue, and I hear somebody across on the other side of the Ocean Avenue shouting, God has a great plan for your life. God has a great plan for your life. And it's like, I wanted to kind of go back and hear exactly what that plan was, because I sometimes think we over-promote God. I sometimes think that we attribute to God more than he actually intends to assure us with. I mean, think about Paul. Paul had clearly a great purpose in his life, but I don't know that you would look back on it and say, hey, I want to live that life, right? It was great, but it was also a very painful life. That sometimes I think we think about God as being our comforter, and we translate, well, if God is our comforter, then shouldn't we be comfortable? It seems to make sense, right? If God is our comforter, then we should be comfortable. But Paul's life was anything but comfortable. Comfortable suggests freedom from affliction. Comfortable suggests a life where we wouldn't have to grieve our losses. And life without affliction, life without loss, life without suffering simply isn't a thing. And a faith that does not account for that is a faith that is destined to disappoint. A faith that does not account for a world that is filled with loss and suffering and affliction is a faith that is bound to disappoint. Paul talks not about freedom from affliction or comfort. Paul talks about comfort in affliction. He provides counsel, and going back earlier in the passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 3, all praise to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. God is our merciful Father and the source of all comfort. He comforts us in all our troubles, not that we don't have troubles, that in our troubles, He comforts us so that we can then comfort others. When they are troubled, we will be able to give them the same comfort God has given us. That our capacity to comfort other people is born of our experience of God's comfort in our lives through and in the midst of our troubles. He comforts us so that we can comfort others with the same comfort He's given us. In May of 2014, my wife, Deb, lost her brother. And it was a battle with cancer. It was a great loss. He was early, mid-50s, and we grieved that. And just in February of 2015, though, her brother died in May of 2014. In May of 2015, or February of 2015, my sister's husband died. So 2 brother-in-laws in less than a year. My kids lost 2 uncles. And the point of me sharing this is this, that my mother-in-law came to the funeral. She lost her son in May of 2014. She comes to the funeral in 2015 of my brother-in-law, and she sees his mom. And I don't even know if they had ever met before, but they both knew that they were mothers who were grieving the loss of their son. And they met straight across the room, and they embraced. And there was something about that embrace that was different than anything else that was going on in the way of comfort. Because there was a common suffering that they were sharing together that brought some measure of comfort even in the midst of the grief. It's not to say that we have to have all the same experiences to be able to comfort other people in their sufferings, but it's true, right? That we are in the greatest position to provide love and support and comfort for those for whom we have shared a similar loss. When we share our sufferings, Paul says, with one another, we receive God's comfort from one another. In verse 7, as you share in our sufferings, you will also share in the comfort God's given us. Our last one another in our series of one another's, and it's not the last one, it's just the last one we're going to get to. We're 8 weeks into this, and we're going to move on next week to something I'm really excited about, but the last one another, comfort one another. The Greek word for comfort is parakleteo. It means to come alongside of, to be along, to call to one side. And it's the same word it's the same, derived from the same word that Jesus used to identify the Holy Spirit. Parakleteos, to comfort. Parakleteo is the Holy Spirit, is the comforter. To comfort one another is to be vulnerable. It's first of all to be vulnerable with our own losses, right? To be willing to share with other people the grief that we feel in our hearts, because the reality is, as long as people think we have our act together and our life together and we don't have anything, and we don't have any suffering and we don't have any affliction, it's very hard for them to share their suffering with us. But when we let down our walls, we give other people permission to not have it all together, to have arrived at the end of the story early, to be vulnerable with our losses. And then to be vulnerable with the losses of other people, to be willing to enter into their lives and their stories in loss, to be present to people in their pain, to be with people in their suffering. Now, to be, this sounds ridiculous, right? But sometimes we just need to acknowledge what's obvious. If you're in one place, you are not in another place, which means to be with someone in their loss is to not be someplace else. To be with people, to be present to people requires sacrifice. It requires us to give something of ourselves up to be with and for someone else. Job's friends, after his calamity of losing all of his business and his family in a single day, his friends came to him. And it says that they came, and because of the greatness of his loss, they just sat with him for 7 days. They were just with him for 7 days in his suffering. Jim Calk is... He's a trainer of pastors in a program called Clinical Pastoral Education. He trains pastors to be with people in their loss. And he's trained generations of pastors. And his treatise on his life and ministry was a book that he wrote, and it's titled this: 90% of help is showing up. 90% of help is showing up. He writes this: one mode of helping easily gets overlooked in the human rush to make things better for fallen comrades. Call it just being there or walking with or intimacy. Often this is the most vital ingredient in any recipe for restoring a broken heart or a shattered spirit. Just being there. Just showing up. Showing up and allowing their pain to touch you. And I hear people say this all the time, and I get it, right? When someone's going through loss, when someone's going through suffering, this, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. And I'm so uncomfortable with that feeling of uncertainty and of doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing that our temptation is to not go, is to stay away. And I'm going to say even that discomfort, right? The discomfort that we feel about going there when we don't have the answers, when we can't fix the problem, is part of sharing in their suffering. Just go. Just be with them. Cry with them. Sit with them. It's a helpless feeling to walk with someone through grief. And helpless doesn't equal happy. We want their pain to go away, but we can't. So we listen. We let them tell their story. We allow their pain. We're making ourselves vulnerable to allowing their pain to touch us. Be present. Be patient. Give people time. Give people space. In our culture, we tend to think of grief as an emotion, right? It's, I'm sad. I'm afraid. I'm angry. We think of grief as an emotion. But emotions are very fluid. Right? I can be sad one moment and happy the next moment. I can be angry one moment and celebrating the next moment. Emotions are very fluid. Grief is not. Grief lingers. And if we treat grief as an emotion, then our aim is, our hope is, our goal is to get it to go away as quickly as we can get it to go away. And that's not how grief works. It's to stay with it. To resist the temptation to circumvent the process. It's true, right? Paul says in Romans 8:28, all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purposes. It's true. I believe that with all of my heart, mind, soul, and strength. All things work for good. God is going to redeem everything. For those of us who love him are called according to a purpose. He is. But that doesn't happen in a minute. It doesn't happen in a day or a week or in a month. Sometimes that happens over the course of a lifetime. Sometimes we don't even get to see it on this side of eternity. It is true. But when we push things and try and rush through the process, we disrupt, interfere with, and derail grief. And it comes in waves, and it goes through stages. Right? That sometimes when you're going through grief, initially it's just this incredible weight that you can't lift, you can't even get up from. And then you start to come back to life a little bit, and you start to feel a little bit more, and then another wave washes over you, and you feel like, I thought I was over this now, but now I'm back in the same spot again. And that happens over and over and over again. To comfort one another through grief is to ride those waves with people and to stay with them in the process. To allow people to stay with us. Be present, be patient. Be helpful. I remember my first significant loss was my mom's dad, my grandpa. And I remember at my grandpa's funeral, at the very end, we're at the graveside, and they're doing the committal service, and he read, I think it's a Robert Frost poem. And these words, he spoke these words, and it like just rattled through my being. He said, life goes on. Life goes on. And I wanted to say no. Life needs to stop. Life needs to recognize, acknowledge that I've experienced a loss here that's significant. And I want the world to stop for a minute and just let me catch my breath and acknowledge the loss that is here. Life shouldn't just go on, but life does, right? Life goes on. And as life goes on, you know what else happens? Grass keeps growing. And houses keep falling apart, and bills keep coming in, and mealtime keeps coming every day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Life goes on, things keep happening, and when we're walking with people through grief, there are a lot of things that we can't do to make their grief go away, but there are some things that we can do just because life goes on. Be helpful. Bring your toolbox, whatever that is. Right? If you're a financial person and you're walking with somebody who's lost a loved one and they're working with all the paperwork and all those things, bring your toolbox. If you're someone who loves to cook, bring your toolbox. If you're someone who can fix a house and someone's going through a loss, bring your toolbox. Bring whatever it is that you have that can help them in very tangible ways in the loss. To bring comfort. Be helpful. And believe. Believe. Grief, whether it's mourning someone who's lost or other kinds of grief that we experience, is a kind of death, right? The life that we had, the life that we were living, the job that we had, the person that we were in a relationship with, that life, whatever that life was, that's gone now. There's a kind of death that has taken place. And with all grief and loss, there is this first death, but there's also the potential for a second death. A second death occurs when we allow bitterness and anger and guilt or resentment to consume our spirit. There's a tragedy in the loss, but there's a second tragedy, or the potential for a second tragedy, in how we then move on from that loss. Sometimes it's out of a sense of trying to prove our loyalty or absolve some sense of guilt that we have by hanging on to our sorrow. We can't let go of our sorrow because we feel like we're letting go or disappointing or giving up on the person. Or exacting some revenge by refusing forgiveness. When grief moves from sorrow into self-pity. Those who face loss eventually must accept the story they had hoped for is no longer a reality and decide to live into a new story. It is a long process. It is a painful process. And as we comfort one another, Paul says in Romans chapter 8, the Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are God's children, we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings, if we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. That when we share in his sufferings, the Spirit's testifying through our spirit, we are believing in God for that person, even when they can't believe in God yet for themselves. And so we can give them permission to rant and yell and rave at God even. We don't have to defend him. Just believe for them. Believe for them. And as they start to move through their grief, believe with them that God is going to somehow redeem and restore and reconcile. And maybe not in this lifetime, they'll never understand, but there is life on the other side of loss. Believe in them as they begin to take those new steps. There is a time when even in grief that we talked about last week, encouraging one another, stirring one another up when people are stuck for too long in the same place and are not moving at all. There's a time to encourage them. Maybe it's time for us to go out for dinner. Maybe it's time for us to go. Maybe it's time now to put your name back in a hat and start looking for a new job. Maybe it's time now to go back to school. Maybe to stir one another up. And maybe sometimes even people respond to their grief and their loss recklessly to admonish. To say, I know this hurts and I know you're in pain, but where you're going is not going to help. It's only going to make matters worse. It takes incredible, right? We talked about when you're admonishing one another, incredible wisdom and discernment, prayer. We don't rush into that. But believing in people, even in their sorrow, even though believing for them, believing with them, believing in them. To comfort one another is to recognize that living is losing. But we have travelers on the journey that we're traveling, that we're walking together through this life with. And that as we do that, as we share together in our sufferings, that God is working in us and through us to help us and to help others in ways that rescue us from the second death and move us forward into a new life. I have, the church put in a new AC, heating and air conditioning in my office a couple years ago. I have this cool thing. It's like I can set up my desk and I can control the temperature. And it makes my office warm in the wintertime and cool in the summertime. And I can control, with this little device, I can control comfort, right? Comfort is about trying to control our world. But life isn't lived in my office. Right? Life is lived in the world. And I can have control there. That's not life. to live life, we have to let go of the things that we would like to control. And we have a very, very high value for comfort in our culture. And we want to control. To love one another is to release that and to step out, to be present, to be patient, to be with people, and to believe in them through the journey. God, I pray that all who are grieving today in whatever way, shape, form, in whatever capacity, God, that you would comfort them in just the ways that they need. And that we would comfort one another, Lord, with the comfort that we've received from you, that we would bring that we would offer that to one another, that we would make the necessary sacrifices, that we would overcome the obstacles and the fears and the insecurities that keep us from going there, and that we would walk even when we don't want to go, and even when we don't know what to say, don't know what to do. Now we go. Because you go with us. Because you're there for us. And allow us to be there for others. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.